All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for stopping by. I'm Vanessa, and today I'll be talking to you a little bit about my summer project called Smarter Screening for Public Benefits. Before we get started, just to introduce myself, I'm the product design intern this summer with the New York City Office of Economic Opportunity, and I just graduated this past May with a bachelor's in information sciences. So today we'll be talking a little bit about the context of the project I'm working on, some heuristic evaluations that inspired the work I did, as well as two of the main features that I was designing and iterating on for the past 10 weeks. I'll talk a little bit more about why content design matters and how much I've learned from it and how it's inspired the work I did, and finally reveal what I would have seen for the redesign of the eligibility screener. So for context, what is NICO? NICO is short for the New York City Office of Economic Opportunity, and that is basically a city government that leverages technology in order to help those in need, like low-income or vulnerable New Yorkers. What is the screener itself? So the screener itself is a 10-step eligibility screener to show what kind of programs you're eligible for, like SNAP or maybe specific housing help, so that New Yorkers of all different backgrounds are able to get the help they need. How might we question was how might we increase screener completions by improving the screener UX? Focusing on those kinds of New Yorkers that I just described, I was going to ideate on really complicated portions of the screener, specifically steps 5 through 10, talking about cash flow inputs and household composition workflows to simplify and make the screener more efficient and understandable. Oops. So first, cash flow input iterations. I know that sounds like a lot, but I wanted to show you what the original screener looks like in terms of how one can input the income and expenses that they have in their daily lifetimes for context. So as you can see here, after inputting the statuses of yourself, like if you're a student or if you have Medicaid, you talk a little bit about your income types and what incomes you receive. Notice how long that drop-down menu was for the income types. There was about 22 for incomes and about 6 to 10 for expenses, and how many pop-ups that there are for these kinds of input questions. When I was ideating, one of the biggest things I wanted to focus on was reducing both of those. Drop-down menus tend to hide information, so I tried to open them all up by categorizing income types into 5 different categories. And after just clicking yes or no, someone or a user can go to the next page to select a more granular income type that is relevant to them before getting only one pop-up as opposed to a bunch of them for the types of amounts and frequencies that they have. Upon testing, what we had found was that not everybody follows the same amount of income type categorization as I do. So for example, veterans pensioner benefits could fall under work income, or maybe it could fall under government income, or something like that. So instead of assuming that all users understood income types like I did, I decided to open up all of the options in one place in this final iteration. Notice how there's no drop-down menus, but there's not also a fixed set of categories either. Instead, I opted for a longer list of all of the options all at once, so that regardless of the type of complicated income expenses or frequencies that you might have, all you need to do is go through 2 pages in order for you to input the type of economic situation that you might find yourselves in. Next, I will show what a household composition workflow looks like in the original screener. So we start here in answering how many people are in your household. So let's say there's 3 people in my household and I'm not the head of household, which basically means the person who pays the most bills. Essentially, in the original screener, instead of separating all of the previous steps into multiple places or pages, now it's combined into one place so that you input one's income, expenses, as well as your relationship to them in one page. That causes a lot of friction because there's a lot of different drop downs and pop-ups that you have to do. And this is only for a household of 3 people. Imagine what that would have been like if it was a bigger household, like a household of 8 people, for example. So in order to expedite that, and then this is also just the last step of what kind of housing situation that you have, as well as the cash on hand, just for context. I wanted to make sure that people were able to fill out their household compositions much easier. So instead of asking for housing situations at the end, I put them in the beginning, just so that all those overarching questions are answered at the very beginning. I made sure that you created things like identification cards, which are basically places where you can understand who you're solving for and who you're describing by color coding, and also having like an icon in order to put the person that you're filling out for with the age and their familial relationships to you. Lastly, and this is something that I was really proud of when I was first designing for household composition, was that instead of having to have so many pages that ask repeatedly about a person's situation, you were able to answer all of those in one place over here, where you can just multi-select whether or not this specific situation pertains to that person. So for example, you don't have to go through 2 to 3 different pages in a household of 3 in order to answer who has Medicaid. You can just do it all in one place here. However, in testing, what I had found that I wasn't really considering large enough households, as I said before, with 7 to 8 people. A lot of people liked being able to fill out each person's information one by one. So what I thought was expediting the survey was actually causing more friction, because people were having more cognitive load about who they're filling things out for and how they can do so properly. So in the final iteration, I landed myself here, where I kept the identity cards, which I tested well, and instead of using a multi-select, kept having all different pages for each different type of user. After filling these cards out, you would then be presented with one-off questions about bigger, less granular questions like head of household, who has income, and who has expenses. And then following the similar patterns of income and expense inputs as I had shown just before. What I had put earlier, as you might have seen, was the overarching questions about household size and household type in the very beginning. But what I noticed in both new and familiar users was that those were deemed more off as summary questions rather than overview questions. So it made more sense to keep them at the end rather than in the beginning. So one of the biggest pivots that I had during my project is learning how to test specifically with content and copy that has been talked about and collaborated with an actual content designer. One of the biggest mistakes that I had made this summer was using placeholder text, as well as using text that I thought was most understandable for myself. And that caused a lot of problems when it came to testing, because a lot of our users didn't really understand the vernacular that I was using in order to do some testing. So for example, this on the left side is what I had originally put in terms of listing all the income and expenses that you might have. Notice how it's really long and more complicated. List all of your expense frequencies to continue, as opposed to the iteration on the right side, which just asks how much and how often do you pay for whatever. So what I learned was that for surveys like this that are so public facing, it's important to make sure that you're being as colloquial as possible, having grade 6 readability standards, as well as making sure that you're talking as if you're speaking. Not only does this develop trust within your user, but it's also easy to understand for all different types of people who are encountering your screener. So I'm really happy to show the redesign of my work. So this is a mobile iteration of someone who's 19 years old, living in the 11228 zip code, and someone who gets Medicaid. Notice how much easier it is to input the amount of income that they get. Instead of having to go through different categories, they just go through one long list, and then being able to input their frequencies easier. The same pattern is repeated for expenses to reduce cognitive load, as I had talked about before. And for a family of 3, it's really easy to talk about your mother and father's situations, both personally and economically, through the identity card method that I just talked about as well. Something that I wanted to show off as well is how easy it is to add a person and save all of the people in your household until you continue to the one-off questions that you see here. So afterwards, as I've shown before, this is the same pattern of the income and expenses type as if you were to fill it out yourself. And I'll just skip over to what happens when you talk about your housing situation. It's right here. Yeah, where it's very similar to the original screener, and using a dropdown to talk about how much money you have for estimation purposes. If I had more time, I'd love to iterate more on what the review your information would look like, because it's really important to make sure you're putting in everything accurately so that you get the most accurate results about the benefits programs that you're eligible for. So in testing, in our very recent testing, I think last week, The users rated the redesign as a 4.25 out of 5, 5 being easy to complete, suggesting that the redesign was much more efficient. Some of the key takeaways I had when working at NICO was the importance of optimizing your workspace and your own work by taking initiative in meetings and asking clarifying questions early. I didn't realize how fast-paced public sector work is. So I wanted to, if I were to redo this again, I would have loved to match the pace by asking questions early and quickly. Designers face a lot of feedback and critiques. So one of the biggest things I also learned was how to filter through the noise and trying to pick the best feedback that made the most sense for the time. So thank you so much for Coding It Forward, for visiting us every Tuesday and teaching us about the public sector work. I found work like this to be very fulfilling, so I'm happy to continue this going forward. And thank you everyone for coming by to my breakout room and joining me a little bit as I talk about my project this summer. And I'm looking forward to answering any questions that you might have. Thank you. Josephine says, how would the identity cards work if you have multiple sisters with roommates of the same age? Yeah, so let's go back. Sorry, I know it's like a lot of slides. Oh, it's right here. Yeah, so regardless, I understand if you're talking about like different ages. Oh, wait, same ages. Yeah, sisters and roommates. That is something that I hadn't considered in terms of that use case, just because we were kind of thinking about smaller households, so households of 3, just for the scope of this project. But if I were to redo it again, I think what I would have done is consider like a color code or something like that, as you can see here, in order for me to sort of differentiate them. I wouldn't do names just because that's too identifying, but that's a really good question. Thank you so much, Josephine. Can I ask John to speak?
Yeah, real quick. I love the mobile first designs, and as a New York resident myself, I think this is awesome. Uh, I'm curious. I love also your user focus. So, like doing user research, hearing from them, and then using that to inform what you were doing, especially with household composition. I'm very curious what the synthesis process looked like for your research. It sounds like you were doing user interviews like with relative frequency, and sometimes synthesis can take a long time. So I'm always curious how other folks do it. What was your process?
Yeah, to be honest, I didn't really do too much of the research portions just because this internship, for me, I wanted to focus on UI design. So I'd used pre-existing data from data models from my coworkers, as well as assuming some of the different needs of our users based on previous data. So I actually didn't really do a lot of user interviews, but we did do a lot of user testings. And that was both done unmoderated and moderated. So getting that kind of data was kind of through the work of my coworkers. Thank you so much, John. Um, so I'm reading Lynn's question. Did you run into any limits on design with the survey technology tool? And if so, how did you balance this in your work? Yeah. So for me, this is my first time working with such public facing products. I've done a lot more products for like news and media design before. So I'm really much more um, I guess, specialize in that kind of like poppy modern design. What I had learned as a constraint was that for such public facing products and devices, like it's really important to encompass like different types of design in terms of making sure it's accommodating for all users who are not that technically savvy or have disabilities or are blind or things like that. So that's why these kinds of iterations are very simple and very straightforward rather than like having something like a type form or a Google form, for example, where there's a lot more restrictions because those are catered for people of all abilities. So that is, I wouldn't say that's a constraint because I think it's important to design for all people. But what I am saying is that it was something new I had to learn in terms of how I was supposed to work around these different types of users so that I can make the best design possible. Thank you, Lynn.
And then, if we have time for a follow-up, I'm curious if you can talk more about, like you mentioned, user interviews didn't necessarily happen, but user research and clearly like deciding between different iterations. How did you make those decisions based on user feedback?
Are you asking about design decisions or the user testing?
The user testing specifically.
Yeah, you're asking like how that process went.
Like, did you look at metrics like, oh, the user like got confused here, or like they took this long to do it with this iteration versus this iteration, or like I'm just kind of curious how you, or balancing with different users, some preferred this iteration versus others. Like, how did you ultimately decide what to do
Yeah.
based on user feedback?
Yeah, honestly, it was really hard. As I was talking about before, feedback is one of the biggest things I learned to filter through this summer. And what I ultimately did to decide which user to listen to is basically doing it by the majority, focusing more on quantitative data rather than just qualitative ones. I'm sorry if that doesn't really answer the question, but honestly, we could talk more about this. I know there's like not time anymore for this breakout, but thank you so much for your questions, everybody. I really appreciate it.